Hi everyone. Let's get into it. So probably some of you have heard of Best Global Brands, maybe some of you haven't, but the idea behind it came from a realization about 20 years ago that Interbrand had become famous for doing brand valuations, which basically looked to put a monetary value on a brand. And we've been doing that for about 10 years, and then we thought, well, why don't we turn that into a ranking of the world's best brands, which we've now been doing for 20 years. Little secret, the methodology is basically really boring, but so you know roughly what it is. We look at lots of financial data. We have a big history of doing role of brand analysis, which is basically talking to a brand and working out to what degree brand is the driver of a purchase. Is it more brand? Is it more price? Is it something else? So we have tons of data on that, and that's the second component. And the third is brand strength, which we'll talk about a tiny bit more. And the other kind of caveat with this before we get into the top 100 is we have some other rules, so we have to be able to find data on them, and because it's called Best Global Brands, they have to have, I think it's more than at least 30% of their revenue outside their home market, so there is a kind of a filter as well there. So these are the 10 brand strength factors. I'm not going to dwell on them for too long. The top, all right, let's see if I can do this. Is that right? Yeah. So the top, these four up here are internal factors. So we spend a lot of time looking at how well understood brand is by the organization itself. And then these six here, starting with authenticity in the whole bottom row, are essentially how good the brand is in customers' eyes. And that's the kind of the third component of it. So let's get into it. So 2019, so there's actually, one of the hard things with this talk is even just looking at 2019, and I will look at the longer term a bit, it's really hard to boil it down into a kind of a small number of themes because there's loads to talk about. But let's give it a go. So here is the top 100, and all of this is obviously, well, it's all over the place, but it is certainly on our website. Lots that's not that surprising, like the prevalence of technology brands, lots of financial service brands, lots of automotive brands. Actually, in some ways, my own personal favourites of all the brands in the top 100 are the two where they're sort of completely unlike any other brand in their world in that they're in this list. So IKEA, which is there at 26, and Lego, which is further down. They're the only furniture brands and toy brands in their category, and I think it's really, or they're the only brands in their category in the top 100, which I think is testament to how amazingly they've built their businesses and built their brands, that clearly it's really hard to build a global toy brand that is big enough to get into the top 100. So I think Lego and IKEA are kind of two personal interests of mine. Let's have a play of this. So this is a bit more on the top 10, just dwelling on them for a second. So actually the top 10 has been relatively stable this year and for the last 2 years. The big mover, which I'll talk about a bit more, is Amazon, which has come into the top 10 from quite a lot lower down very quickly. But of some of the rises to call out, so MasterCard, Salesforce, Amazon, Gucci, Starbucks. I'll talk a bit more about some of these. And some kind of notable fallers, so Coca-Cola and IBM. These are two of the brands which were in the original list which we made in 2000. Both still doing amazing things, but have not had great 2019s in terms of brand building. And actually, two brands I've worked on in my past, General Electric and IBM, have both worked on. General Electric had an especially bad year, unfortunately. And some new entrants, so Uber and LinkedIn. Dell were in it previously and have came off the stock exchange, so it was hard to get financial data, so we took them out of the list, but they've been reborn as Dell Technologies and are back in. So as I said, it's actually really hard to kind of boil down the whole thing into two themes. But the ones I want to talk about are these two here. So overall, the things we see are brands being successful by responding to technology and cultural change really effectively. And beyond that, going beyond responsiveness, and I'll talk a bit more about what we mean by that. Before we get into some examples, so we did some analysis actually last year, but it's still relevant this year, that going back to those brand strength factors, the brands that were tending to move faster over-indexed on relevance and responsiveness among the brand strength factors. So overall, the message is brands where responsiveness is actually the internal team's readiness to change, and relevance is perception that this is a relevant brand in the current world. So brands that do these two things well are tending to grow faster. And so some examples, so McDonald's have had a very good time recently, and it led us to this thought of like, what is a digital brand in the year 2019? Because overall, one of the things that we're seeing is that some non-digitally native brands are doing very well, like McDonald's, partly because of their digital strategies, and some digitally native brands, notably eBay, as well as some of the ones I talked about earlier, are struggling. So it kind of in the year 2019, although digital is arguably more important than ever, that's not about being a digital brand natively, it's about how well you're deploying digital strategies. So some of the things they're doing, so I mean, I guess lots of us have probably done the touch screens, but they're doing lots of other smart things as well. Some of them quite surprising. So they have a big voice AI initiative. You can start a job application to McDonald's through Alexa or Google. So you can say, Alexa, I'd like to apply to work at McDonald's. They have a big Silicon Valley tech hub, which is driving a lot of these things and making some acquisitions in personalization. A similar thought around MasterCard. So I can still remember my mum having one of those sort of swipey physical things in the 80s and signing. So it's most definitely not originally a digital brand, but they're doing incredibly well in digital. One of the smartest things is they got ahead of consumer fintech. So if you're a fintech brand, you're probably kind of veered a bit more towards them than their competitors, which is why they appear on the Monzo cards and the N26 cards and so on. So while consumer banking is changing a lot, people still need digital payments. Whoever you are, you still need digital payments, and they've positioned themselves very well to play in that space. They've also, in a more design sense, they've simplified their logo, which no doubt is driven by lots of things, but I think it's partly about simplification for a digital world. So kind of one other big development, and of all the factors driving brand growth, this is another one, this idea of owning brand channels. So Microsoft, in lots of ways, the kind of quintessential software brand, opened their first store in the UK this year in Oxford Circus. And there's a couple of things at play here, we think. One is about kind of presence and tangibility, especially for something as intangible as software. And the other thing is about data, and that's kind of one of the high-level learnings of the last 20 years when we start looking back, is the companies that are able to generate tons of data on their own users and take actions from it and personalize on it tend to do better. So this idea of having own brand channels, partly because it gets you close to your customers and partly because you generate better data about them, is definitely something which we're seeing. And this is a funny one. Does anyone know what store this is? I mean, you'll be able to guess. There's a couple of telltale signs. It's Amazon, yeah. So there's a sort of related point a little bit here that even brands with very good channels, with Amazon's nothing if not a good channel, are expanding. And there's some actually really good commentary about this. So it's called Amazon 4-Star Store. I think they're only in the US at the moment. There certainly aren't very many. And the basic idea is anything which has been rated 4 stars or more on Amazon can end up in this shop. And this guy on Twitter commented that basically going into an Amazon 4-star store is like it's like some really clever people who have seen what a shop looks like on Google Street View but never actually been into a shop have created a shop. Because there's kind of like, you might sit next to like a noodle boiling machine next to Harry Potter, next to a Roomba, and it's like this is not a shop in any normal sense. And the sort of the interesting point which the guy makes though is like Amazon are definitely clever, and this sort of seems to make no sense. But maybe when clever people do things which make no sense, maybe they're just sort of hitting on something new. And because it's Amazon, they're kind of ruthlessly kind of experimenting the whole time, and who knows, maybe they're onto something. There is a converse to this. The companies that are doing well are able to proliferate or manage their own channels really well. And unfortunately, on the flip side, actually really strong brands. Pampers has tons of heritage. Gillette, just as much. They have not had good 2019s, and I think this is partly because they have fallen behind in how their products get to market. And this idea of channels is, I wouldn't say it's passed them by. I'm sure there's tons of very clever people thinking about it a lot, but they haven't yet managed to thrive in the kind of changing channel world. Whatever you think of Gillette's the best a man can be advertising, and obviously some people love it, some people hate it. We would say it's kind of only half of the problem. There's a view of masculinity which they've changed their view of, but there's also like, how do people want to get shaving products in the year 2019? And they're less well positioned to answer that question than notable rivals. There's more to change than technology change, of course. There's also cultural change and change in people's values. And, this is totally personal opinion, but if 2019 is about one person, it's probably about this person. She's kind of owned 2019. She didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize, but if she had, she would have been the youngest ever recipient. And she's changing cultural values, in front of our very eyes. We have kind of active conversations with companies in the sustainable energy space going on, and one of the points we're making to them is, good ideas and good branding and good ways of thinking about what you're trying to do in the world from 2017. That's probably out of date now. That's probably like 2 years in this space is probably a long time. So just wanted to dwell a little bit on what brands are doing and what the top 100 brands are doing to tackle the climate crisis, as we now need to call it. Well, of course, like the first thing, like maybe the oldest sort of personal brand part of this crisis is cars, which most of us drive. Tesla have had a really good second half of the year. There's still lots of questions about whether a business of their size can thrive in a market as established as automotive, but they're certainly making a very good go of it, and they definitely have made themselves synonymous with electric cars. But going a bit further back, Toyota have actually had a very good year. Their Prius is a little less dominant than it was, but it's worth remembering the Prius is really old. It's like 15 plus years old, hybrid obviously, and they have a slightly different strategy to Tesla. So actually Tesla's doing quite well, but not at the expense of someone like Toyota. So Toyota are saying we're about mobility rather than cars. We want to put hybrid technology in more types of cars and to SUVs, but actually the bigger play for us is about enabling more car sharing, working with the big car sharing businesses like Uber and others, and networking cars, so overall there's fewer cars on the road. So I think there's probably, although Tesla gets tons of fame, Toyota certainly are doing amazing things, which is both building their brand and making a difference. Obviously, the second thing is, okay, so here's how I drive around the world, but I need to put clothes on my body. And there's really interesting things happening. So Adidas are doing well. They've grown their brand value this year by 11%. And they released this pair of trainers, which are called the Loop 2, I think. Yep. And it's fully closed loop is the idea. So closed loop, for those who are not familiar, is basically a sort of ethos in design of trying to kind of reuse. The real specialists would say it's not just recycling, because it's about using materials to begin with which carry on being useful and don't degrade in quality as they get reused. But this is a fully closed loop trainer, and it's one of a few other things in this space that they're doing. And I think it's probably not true to say that the companies in BGB that are doing more sustainability stuff are also, that's the thing that's driving their brand success. But there's definite kind of correlation that between companies that have the confidence to be trying to get ahead of this issue and companies that tend to be performing well. Of course, the other thing that we all do, which has an impact on the planet, is eat. I don't think us farting has an impact on the planet, but maybe that does too. Cows farting definitely does have an impact on the planet. It's been an interesting year for plant-based foods. So Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, which are two US companies listed on the stock exchange in the US, have not actually done that brilliantly on the stock exchange, but they're still good businesses. Too small to be on BGB at the moment in terms of financial scale, but interesting what could happen to them. So there's But there's a few different food businesses on BGB, but these three here, kind of relatively flat, not setting the world alight in 2019. It's going to be really interesting to see how they respond to this. I mean, they're definitely doing stuff already, but presumably, if you're a manager in these sorts of companies, you're thinking, well, that's a pretty clear sort of growth opportunity. Veganism, flexitarianism, whether it's through acquisition or through innovation, we'll see. But there's more to values than sustainability, and I'm interested to hear what others think, but probably we were talking about a bit in the office, and if there's one piece of visual brand design from the last 10 years, which has been, including everything, not just commercial brands, which has been successful, it's this, the Pride rainbow. And arguably, too successful. There's been accusations that it gets co-opted by brands. I think Dr. Martens, it probably feels like it is more credible. Listerine was one that did get called out. I mean, I actually personally have a little sympathy for them. It does feel a little bandwagon jumpy, but generally the brand managers that we speak to are kind of like, no, we actually believe in this issue and we want to support it. It ends up feeling like bandwagon jumping, and whether it adds brand equity or not, I'm not sure when the link is not so clear. And on the point about credibility when it comes to gender, Gucci have had a very good year. They have released this film called The Future is Fluid. The image speaks for itself. But one of the things with this initiative is it does feel credible. If I'm very not an expert on the fashion world or in the fashion world at all, but if you follow luxury fashion, I think it does feel credible because they've been talking about gender equality for a long time and are committed to it, and it doesn't feel like an ad campaign. And they're doing very well, and this is part of it. So kind of lots of stuff on responding to change and brands that are responding to change, and that as a driver of brand growth. But there's a bigger thing we think, which is about going beyond customer responsiveness and kind of getting ahead of change a little bit more. And that's the second part of what I'm going to talk about in this section. So we know that relevance and responsiveness are good, but we think the leading brands do more. So here's a little question. Call out who this is. Oh, you guys are too good. Interbrand are clearly a little behind us, but I showed this to a lot of people, and it took a long time to get to Starbucks. But this is Starbucks' Reserve Roastery in Milan, and they have, I think, 5 others around the world. They don't all look exactly like this, which is kind of interesting for a big, quote-unquote chain brand, that they deliberately don't all look like this in itself, but they're all as striking, they're all as bold. I think they just opened one in Chicago, which is as big as a department store. It is still a coffee shop. It's kind of insane to think. But one of the things that struck out, I mean, this is nothing if not bold design. Is it kind of do we need a cathedral to coffee in our life? I don't know, maybe, but good on them for boldness. So they're doing this sort of stuff at one extreme, but they're also just kind of executing and finding logical adjacencies. And I don't want to downplay the talent of the people who've come up with Starbucks creamer, but I'm like, it's a dairy product. You're going to distribute it through supermarkets. It's going to have some flavour in it. We're going to brand it really nicely, and we think people are going to buy them, and they're probably right. But it doesn't feel as earth-shattering as like a cathedral to coffee. But just finding these logical adjacencies and then executing at scale, or else just keeping up. Starbucks most definitely didn't invent nitro cold brew, but boy, are they going to go after it once it becomes popular. And maybe we all think, well, copying's bad and so on, but I think for big brands, it's not what it's about. I think you need to do both these things of keep up, keep moving, stay relevant, incremental innovations, while also having a few kind of signature things you're doing, which are just like, wow, have you seen what Starbucks have just done? And similarly on Amazon, who's the other example that we think are doing this very well. So this is an ad actually for Amazon Key, which maybe we're being a little unfair saying this is an incremental innovation, but Starbucks is about getting you the thing. And this is like the Starbucks person comes to my door, and now I can buy an Amazon Key, and rather than them leave it outside the door, which doesn't feel like it's that bad, but rather than leave it outside the door, they can buzz into your house and leave it there just like this. and then your new sandwich toast is safe when you get home. Again, we sort of say this is it's good, and it's kind of amazing that they're building this level of trust with customers, but it still feels relatively incremental to us. It's like, what else can we do? The amazing thing that Starbucks do is lots of incremental innovation, which makes sense and they execute, and sometimes they go well, sometimes they go badly, but they keep doing them. But the success of Amazon and the reason they've shot up so much in the last few years is they've got basically a decade of really big brand moves behind them. So I was amazed that Prime was as early as 2005, Amazon Web Services 2006. In lots of ways, Kindle seems like the least exciting thing there. Kindle's a relatively big deal, but when you put it next to Prime or AWS, less so. And then you look at Alexa and think, well, hang on, Prime, it's taken 10 plus years for them to really deliver on Prime and make Prime as amazing as it's been. So we're actually quite early on in Alexa, and we're really early on in Amazon Go. So how big are those things going to be for them? But again, it's this mix of incremental innovations and thinking really big. Pure speculation, this on our part, but they are definitely doing this. I should say they are definitely doing a thing called Amazon Care, which is for employees, and they're piloting it. And it's basically digital healthcare. Currently, if you're an Amazon employee. And actually an Amazon employee in a specific region. But it's really interesting to think that a little different in the UK where we have the NHS and it's fairly good. The US, it's very expensive and not as good. But Amazon as a healthcare brand, who knows? It's very attractive to them. It's a massive market. They're very good at technology. They're very good at customer data. They're very good at connecting other service providers for a market. Who knows? We could be sitting here in 10 years and that's a big part of their business. Cool. This sort of notion of incremental optimization and kind of thinking really big, that's really sort of key to how we're seeing brands and what we're seeing that the fastest growing brands do. And I just wanted to sort of bring that together a little bit and tell you, sort of give a bit more background on why we think it's so important. So the first point is this, that we live in an era of kind of where we as people and consumers get to be divinely discontent. If the tech that connects you speaking to someone on the other side of the world doesn't work perfect, you're like, what the fuck, man? We in the thing, waiting for 2 days is way too long, and there's kind of constant updates. And also, I think one of the things that we all do is transfer a good experience in one category into our expectations of another category, which is in a sense a little unfair, but we've just all got in the habit of doing it. And that's what's driven this feeling that customer expectations are generally moving faster than business. Our view as a result is if you're kind of thinking in terms of ongoing change, the broken line is customer expectations. The red line is what you're doing as a strategist. If you're thinking in terms of ongoing change, you're kind of going to get close to the line of customer expectation, then you're going to fall away a bit, and then you get close again, but you're probably not doing enough, basically. You're probably going to, over time, going to drift further away. So we think brands need to think in these terms. We think they need to make bold moves to kind of leap ahead, which is what we've illustrated here. So it's only when you think really bold and get ahead of customer expectations that you're able to kind of stay in touch. This is how we define an iconic move. It alters the competitive landscape and it captures people's imagination. Kind of as simple as that. And it could be a product innovation. It could be design. It could be the way you're using a channel. But we think it's the brands that are able to think in this way as well as ongoing optimization that are thriving. I'm going to talk briefly about the sort of 19 years which have preceded 2019 since we've been doing this data. But let's have a look at, this is 2001 to 2019, and it's to scale. So this is the value of the most valuable 100 brands in 2001 cumulatively, and this is 2019. So the good news for everyone in this room is brands have grown much faster than the economy. So brand building is a good business to be in. But let's have a look at how the top 25 have changed in that time. I've kind of watched this multiple times and I get a bit hypnotized by it every time. Sorry it's slightly pixelated, but... So wait for Apple to appear in a second. So it's 2007, kind of doesn't feel that long ago in a way. And here's Apple, 2008, and there they go. And oh, they didn't have a good year. And then we did a really good iPhone, and now we're the biggest brand in the world. So in 4 years, 2008, they were 24th, 2012, they're the biggest brand in the world, have been doing it ever since. So I'd say quite a lot of stability in the last year or so, apart from Amazon's incredible rise. Cool, so again, there's kind of too much to talk about even if you look at the top 25. So I've got 2 themes and I'm going to move through them very fast. They ended up being a bit personal actually to me because I'm like, there's too much in the last 19 years. It's like, what stories do you want to tell? And so I ended up telling one about software and one about identity brands. So this quote comes from a guy called Mark Andreessen who developed one of the first one of the first internet browsers called Netscape, and then ultimately became a venture capitalist. And his thesis is essentially that software businesses are going to be everyone, in which he includes internet businesses when he says software businesses. The biggest company in every market is going to be a software business. That's his view of the world. He's biased, obviously, but he's kind of not totally wrong when you look at what's happened to BGB in the last 20 years. And you look at this, and I've like hacked it out with a pencil and said, well, he's kind of right. Like all these are predominantly or solely software businesses. I've kind of deliberately sort of probably Apple's more of a hardware business than I'm allowing for there, but Apple's kind of a software business as well. And we think one of our thesis to this point of iconic moves is that these big companies which have come to dominate BGB, they're more than they've done more than just create massive companies. We think they're sort of slightly changing the nature of brand, and we think their ability to shapeshift at speed and actually be incredibly dynamic in how they define themselves is a slightly new mindset for people who work in brands. So there are definitely still constants, of which actually visual design is probably one of them. Internal culture, which is probably another, but after that, they're like, well, if we think we can do something good in that market, then we're going to go after it. And the sort of notions of positioning and owning territories, they're not into that. Partly why I think they use verbal language so little, but they don't want to build an equity around owning a specific territory. The masters of this are Apple and Google, arguably, as well as Amazon, but they've risen incredibly fast, as that video showed. They haven't. It's not that it's always been like this. Actually, we kind of forget it, but these have been the biggest brands in the world for not very long. We've just got so used to it that we've kind of forgotten how quickly they've risen. And just to say, there's an argument that's like, yeah, but those guys are exceptional. They're Apple. They get to do that. They get to move really fast. But it's actually not to do with them being exceptional companies, which clearly they are. It's to do with the infrastructure which supports innovation. So this slide shows the time it took to get to 100% of US households for different technologies. And there's a glib side of this that it took air travel 68 years and it took Pokemon Go 19 days. But there's a bigger point, which is just the lines at this end are really steep and the lines at that end take longer to go upwards. So it's not just about these companies being exceptional, it's that the whole infrastructure around innovation means speed happens, speed is more powerful. And of course it's created a new way of telling jokes as well. So in 1998 this guy sold you books, and in 2017 he sells you whatever the fuck he wants. But I think software's eating the world, but kind of, I'd say. I think partly as a brand person, actually partly just looking at the facts, I think it's only partly true to say software's eating the world. For instance, did consumer electronics really shrink? Did they get really small between 2001 and 2019? No, they didn't. They just got eaten by Apple and Samsung. And I think there's partly an artifact of our use of colours here. But consumer electronics is still a really big deal. Arguably, it's a bigger deal than ever. And of course, there's the other fact that auto is still a massive deal. That's got a lot bigger, really a huge amount driven, but mostly driven by China and India rather than software, technology, or anything else. And the last bit is, I guess, a bit more personal to me still, which is identity brands. So back in 2001, all of these 6 businesses here were in the top 100. And they're all, I would say, identity brands. And for me personally, and maybe for some of you as well, learning and thinking about how Levi's and Harley Davidson had used cultural relevance to grow their brands was part of me thinking about branding as a craft. And And I wouldn't say they've totally disappeared, but these types of businesses are no longer the biggest brands in the world, essentially. Partly Marlboro, yeah, kind of health happened and regulation happened, but I think there is something else going on, which is, part of it is that we would say sort of image-based brands generally seem to be losing to businesses where the brand is really embedded within the business. So, you know, Levi's, we probably all remember amazing advertising in the 80s and 90s, but it's still essentially you know, a commodity product which they get BBH to turn into you know, kind of sex essentially. Whereas Zara, which probably all of us know, but some of us might not know, that they what's so amazing about that business is they set out from the start to have very little distance between the shop and the factory, which means they produce stuff in smaller runs. It means if something's really doing really well, they produce more of it. They don't produce massive runs, so they don't have to discount it at the end. So these kind of brand differentiators, which show up in your experience because stock changes more often, I impulse buy more as a result, but the brand differentiators are like embedded in the business in a way that's much less true of Levi's. So we think these image-based brands lose to business model-based brands. And this is similar. I mean, these two companies never really competed against each other and definitely don't now, but MTV, you know, unquestionably an iconic brand in the 80s. Spotify, is it iconic? I mean, no. Actually, my colleague Joe described it as kind of an operational part of my life, which in some ways probably Spotify would like to hear. In other ways, we'd be like, oh, that sounds boring. But overall, kind of huge choice and clever recommendations driven by data is kind of like, that's kind of beaten cultural iconicity, whether you like that or not. So cool. So some final thoughts from me, which are basically just to say this: we're really excited. We think it's a great time to work in brands. We're working brand, and actually the data says that working in brand is a good place to be. That's outperforming the market. We totally agree that technology plays more of a role than ever, but we think that means that the human qualities of brands and the human side of brands is more important, not less important. And we think there's tons of work to do to help brands make iconic moves and connect with Gen Z and connect with millennials and in some cases kind of advance the issues like sustainability, which we all care about. So we hope you're all excited too. It's a good place to be. Thanks very much.